The appointment kept. The church clocks chimed 11:15 as two figures emerged on London Bridge. One, which advanced with a swift and rapid step, was that of a woman, who looked eagerly about her as though in quest of some expected object. The other figure was that of a man who slunk along in the deepest shadow he could find, and at some distance accommodated his pace to hers, stopping when she stopped, and as she moved again, creeping stealthily on, but never allowing himself in the ardor of his pursuit to gain upon her footsteps. Thus they crossed the bridge. From the Middlesex to the Surrey shore, when the woman, apparently disappointed in her anxious scrutiny of the foot passengers, turned back. The movement was sudden, but he who watched her was not thrown off his guard by it, for shrinking into one of the recesses which surmount the piers of the bridge, and leaning over the parapet the better to conceal his figure, he suffered her to pass by on the opposite pavement, and when she was about the same distance in advance as she had been before, slipped quietly down and followed her again. At nearly the center, she stopped. The man stopped too. It was a very dark night. The day had been unfavorable, and at that hour and place there were few people stirring. Such as there were hurried quickly past, very possibly without seeing, but certainly without noticing, either the woman or the man who kept her in view. Their appearance was not calculated to attract the importunate regards of such of London's destitute population as chanced to take their way over the bridge that night in search of some cold arch or doorless hovel wherein to lay their heads. They stood there in silence, neither speaking nor spoken to by anyone who passed. A mist hung over the river, deepening the red glare of the fires that burnt upon the small craft moored off the different wharfs, and rendering darker and more indistinct the murky buildings on the banks. The old smoke-stained storehouses on either side rose heavy and dull from the dense mass of roofs and gables, and frowned sternly upon water too black to reflect even their lumbering shapes. The tower of old St. Saviour's Church and the spire of St. Magnus, so long the giant warders of the ancient bridge, were visible in the gloom, but the forest of shipping below bridge and the thickly scattered spires of churches above were nearly all hidden from the sight. The girl had taken a few restless steps, turns to and fro, closely watched meanwhile by her hidden observer, when the heavy bell of St. Paul's tolled for the death of another day. Midnight had come upon the crowded city, the palace, the night cellar, the jail, the madhouse, the chambers of birth and death, of health and sickness, the rigid face of the corpse, and the calm sleep of the child. Midnight was upon them all. The hour had not struck 2 minutes when a young lady, accompanied by a gray-haired gentleman, alighted from a hackney carriage within a short distance of the bridge, and having dismissed the vehicle, walked straight towards it. They had scarcely set foot upon its pavement when the girl started and immediately made towards them. They walked onwards, looking about them with the air of persons who entertained some very slight expectation, which had little chance of being realized, when they were suddenly joined by this new associate. They halted with an exclamation of surprise, but suppressed it immediately, for a man in the garments of a countryman came close up, brushed against them indeed, at that precise moment. "Not here," said Nancy hurriedly. "I'm afraid to speak to you here. Come away, out of the public road, down the steps yonder." As she uttered these words, and indicated with her hand the direction in which she wished them to proceed, The countryman looked round, and roughly asking what they took up the whole pavement for, passed on. The steps to which the girl had pointed were those which, on the Surrey bank, and on the same side of the bridge as St. Saviour's Church, form a landing stairs. From the river to this spot the man bearing the appearance of a countryman hastened unobserved, and after a moment's survey of the place, he began to descend. The stairs are a part of the bridge. They consist of 3 flights. Just below the end of the second, going down, the stone wall on the left terminates in an ornamental pier or pedestal facing towards the Thames. At this point, the lower steps widen, so that a person turning that angle of the wall is necessarily unseen by any others on the stairs who chance to be above him, if only a step. The countryman looked hastily round when he reached this point, and as there seemed no better place of concealment, and the tide being out, there was plenty of room, he slipped aside with his back to the pier, and there waited, pretty certain that they would come no lower, and that even if he could not hear what was said, he could follow them again with safety. So tardily stole the time in this lonely place, and so eager was the spy to penetrate the motives of an interview so different from what he had been led to expect, that he more than once gave the matter up for lost, and persuaded himself either that they had stopped far above, or resorted to some entirely different spot to hold their mysterious conversation. He was on the very point of emerging from his hiding place and regaining the road above, when he heard the sound of footsteps, and directly afterwards of voices almost close at ear. He drew himself straight upright against the wall, and swore. "This is far enough," said a voice, which was evidently that of the gentleman. "I will not suffer this young lady to go any further. Many people would have distrusted you too much to have come even so far. But you see I am willing to humor you." "To humor me?" cried the voice of the girl whom he had followed. "You're considerate indeed, sir, to humor me. Well, it's no matter." "Why? For what?" said the gentleman in a kinder tone. "For what purpose can you have brought us to this strange place? Why not have let me speak to you above there, where is light, and there is something stirring, instead of bringing us to the dark and dismal hole?" "I told you before," replied Nancy, "that I was afraid to speak to you there. I don't know why it is," said the girl, shuddering, "but I have such a fear and dread upon me tonight that I can hardly stand." "A fear of what?" asked the gentleman, who seemed to pity her. "I scarcely know of what," replied the girl. "I wish I did. Horrible thoughts of death, and shrouds with blood upon them, and a fear that has made me burn as if I were on fire, have been upon me all day. I was reading a book tonight to while the time away, and the same things came into the print." "Imagination," said the gentleman, soothing her. "No imagination," replied the girl in a hoarse voice. "I'll swear I saw coffin written in every page of the book in large black letters. Aye, and they carried one close to me in the streets tonight." "There's nothing unusual in that," said the gentleman. "They have passed me often." "Real ones," rejoined the girl. "This was not." There was something so uncommon in her manner that the flesh of the concealed listener crept as he heard the girl utter these words, and the blood chilled within him. He had never experienced a greater relief than hearing the sweet voice of the young lady as she begged her to be calm and not allow herself to become the prey of such fearful fancies. "Speak to her kindly," said the young lady to her companion. "Poor creature, she seems to need it." "Your haughty religious people would have held their heads up to see me as I am tonight, and preached of flames and vengeance," cried the girl. "Oh, dear lady, why aren't those who claim to be God's own folks as gentle and as kind to us poor wretches as you, who, having youth and beauty and all that they have lost, might be a little proud, instead of so much humbler?" "Ah," said the gentleman, "a Turk turns his face, after washing it well, to the east when he says his prayers. These good people, after giving their faces such a rub with the world as takes the smiles off, turn with no less regularity to the darkest side of heaven. Between the Mussulman and the Pharisee, commend me to the first." These words appeared to be addressed to the young lady, and were perhaps uttered with the view of affording Nancy time to recover herself. The gentleman shortly afterwards addressed himself to her. "You were not here last Sunday night," he said. "I couldn't come," replied Nancy. "I was kept by force." "By whom?" "Bill, him that I told the young lady of before." "You are not suspected of holding any communication with anybody on the subject which has brought us here tonight, I hope?" asked the old gentleman anxiously. "No," replied the girl, shaking her head. "It's not very easy for me to leave him unless he knows why. I couldn't have seen the lady when I did, but that I gave him a drink of laudanum before I came away." "Did he awake before you returned?" inquired the gentleman. "No, and neither he nor any of them suspect me." "Good," said the gentleman. "Now, listen to me." "I'm ready," replied the girl, as he paused for a moment. "This young lady," the gentleman began, "has communicated to me and some of her friends, who can be safely trusted, which you told her nearly a fortnight since. I confess to you that I had doubts at first whether you were to be implicitly relied upon, but now I firmly believe you are." "I am," said the girl earnestly. "I repeat that I firmly believe it. To prove to you that I am disposed to trust you, I tell you, without reserve, that we propose to extort the secret, whatever it may be, from the fears of this man Monks. But if, said the gentleman, he cannot be secured, or, if secured, cannot be acted upon as we wish, you must deliver up Graciano." "Fagin!" cried the girl, recoiling. "That man must be delivered up by you," said the gentleman. "I will not do it. I will never do it," replied the girl. "Devil that he is, and worse than devil as he has been to me, I will never do that." "You will not?" said the gentleman, who seemed fully prepared for this answer. "Never," returned the girl. "Tell me why." "For one reason," rejoined the girl firmly. "For one reason, that the lady knows and will stand by me in, I know she will, for I have ever her promise. And for this other reason besides, that bad life as he has led, I have led a bad life too. There are many of us who have kept the same courses together, and I'll not turn upon them, who might, any of them, have turned upon me, but didn't, bad as they are." "Then," said the gentleman quickly, as if this had been the point he had been aiming to attain, "put Monks into my hands, and leave him to me to deal with." "What if he turns against the others?" "I promise you that in that case If the truth is forced from him, there the matter will rest. There must be circumstances in Oliver's little history which it would be painful to drag before the public eye, and if the truth is once elicited, they shall go scot-free. And if it is not, suggested the girl, then, pursued the gentleman, this Fagin shall not be brought to justice without your consent. In such a case, I could show you reasons, I think, which would induce you to yield it. Have I the lady's promise for that? Asked the girl eagerly. You have, replied Rose, my true and faithful pledge. Monks would never learn how you knew what you do, said the girl after a short pause. Never, replied the gentleman. The intelligence should be so brought to bear upon him that he could never even guess. I have been a liar and among liars from a little child, said the girl after another interval of silence, but I will take your words. After receiving an assurance from both that she might safely do so, she proceeded in a voice so low that it was often difficult for the listener to discover even the purport of what she had said, to describe by name and situation the public house whence she had been followed that night. From the manner in which she occasionally paused, it appeared as if the gentlemen were making some hasty notes of the information she communicated. When she had thoroughly explained the localities of the place, the best bad deeds that under brimstone he had not moved, he had been afraid to stir. There had been a moan and motion of the hand, and with terror added to hate he had struck and struck again. Once he threw a rug over it, but it was worse to fancy the eyes, and imagine them moving towards him, than to see them glaring upwards, as if watching the reflection of the pool of gore that quivered and danced in the sunlight on the ceiling. He had plucked it off again, and there was the body, mere flesh and blood, no more, but such flesh and such blood. He struck a light, kindled a fire, and thrust the club into it. There was human hair upon the end, which blazed and shrunk into a light cinder, and caught by the air, whirled up the chimney. Even that frightened him, sturdy as he was, but he held the weapon till it broke, and then piled it on the coals to burn away, and smolder into ashes. He washed himself, and rubbed his clothes. There were spots that would not be removed, but he cut the pieces out and burnt them. How those stains were dispersed about the room! The very feet of the dog were bloody. All this time he had never once turned his back upon the corpse. No, not for a moment. Such preparations completed, he moved backwards towards the door, dragging the dog with him, lest he should carry out new evidences of the crime into the streets. He shut the door softly, locked it, took the key, and left the house. He crossed over and glanced up at the window to be sure that nothing was visible from the outside. There was the curtain still drawn, which she would have opened to admit the light she never saw again. It lay nearly under there. He knew that. God, how the sun poured down upon the very spot! The glance was instantaneous. It was a relief to have got free of the room. He whistled on to the dog and walked rapidly away. He went through Islington strode up the hill at Highgate, on which stands the stone in honor of Whittington, turned down to Highgate Hill, unsteady of purpose, and uncertain where to go, struck off to the right again almost as soon as he began to descend it, and taking the footpath across the fields, skirted Cane Wood, and so came out on Hampstead Heath. Traversing the hollow by the Vale of Heath, he mounted the opposite bank, and crossing the road which joins the villages of Hampstead and Highgate, made along the remaining portion of the heath to the field at North End, in one of which he laid himself down under a hedge and slept. Soon he was up again and away, not far into the country, but back towards London by the high road, then back again, then over another part of the same ground as he had already traversed, then wandering up and down in fields, and lying on ditches. Brinks to rest, and starting up to make for some other spot do the same, and ramble on again. Where could he go? That was near, and not too public, to get some meat and drink. Hendon, that was a good place, not far off, and out of most people's ways. Thither he directed his steps. Running sometimes, and sometimes, with a strange perversity, loitering at a snail's pace, or stopping altogether. And idly breaking the hedges with his stick. But when he got there, all the people he met, the very children at the doors, seemed to view him with suspicion. Back he turned again, without the courage to purchase bit or drop, though he had tasted no food for many hours. And once more he lingered on the heath, uncertain where to go. He wandered over miles and miles of ground, and still came back to the old place. Morning and noon had passed. And the day was on the wane, and still he rambled to and fro, and up and down, and round, and still lingered about the same spot. At last he got away, and shaped his course for Hatfield. It was 9 o'clock at night when the man, quite tired out, and the dog limping and lame from the unaccustomed exercise, turned down the hill by the church of the quiet village, and plodding along the little street, crept into a small public house, whose scanty light had guided them to the spot. There was a fire in the tap room, and some country laborers were drinking before it. He made room for the stranger, but he sat down in the farthest corner, and ate and drank alone, or rather with his dog, to whom he cast a morsel of food from time to time. The conversation of the men assembled here. Turned upon the neighboring land and farmers, and when those topics were exhausted, upon the age of some old man who had been buried on the previous Sunday. The young men present considering him very old, and the old men present declaring him to have been quite young, not older, one white-haired grandfather said, than he was. With 10 or 15 years of life in him at least, if he had taken care. There is nothing to attract attention or excite alarm in this. The robber, after paying his reckoning, sat silent and unnoticed in his corner, and had almost dropped asleep when he was half wakened by the noisy entrance of a newcomer. This was an antic fellow, half peddler and half mountebank, who traveled about the country on foot to vend hones, strops, razors, washballs, harness paint, medicines for dogs and horses, cheap perfumery, cosmetics, and such like wares, which he carried in a case slung to his back. His entrance was the signal for various homely jokes with the countrymen, which slackened not until he had made his supper, and opened his box of treasures, when he ingeniously contrived to unite business with amusement. "And what be that stuff? Good to eat, Harry?" asked a grinning countryman, pointing to some composition cakes in one corner. "This," said the fellow, producing one, "this is the infallible and invaluable composition for removing all sorts of stain, rust, dirt, mildew, spick, speck, spot, or spatter from silk, satin, linen, cambric, cloth, crepe, stuff, carpet, merino, muslin, bombazine, or woolen stuff. Wine stains, fruit stains, beer stains, water stains, paint stains, pitch stains, any stains come out at one rub with the infallible and invaluable composition. If a lady stains her honor, she has only need to swallow one cake, and she is cured at once, for it's poison. If a gentleman wants to prove his, he has only need to bolt one little square, and he has put it beyond question, for it's quite as satisfactory as a pistol bullet, and a great deal nastier in the flavor. Consequently, the more credit in taking it. 1 penny a square, with all these virtues, 1 penny a square." There were 2 buyers directly, and more of the listeners plainly hesitated. The vendor, observing this, increased in loquacity. "It's all bought up as fast as it can be made," said the fellow. "There are 14 watermills, 6 steam engines, and a galvanic battery always working upon it, and they can't make it fast enough, though the men work so hard that they die off, and the windows is pensioned directly with £20 a year. The widows, not the windows. The widows is pensioned directly with £20 a year for each of the children, and a premium of 50 for twins, 1 penny a square. 2 halfpence is all the same, and 4 farthings is received with joy. 1 penny in a square. Wine stains, fruit stains, beer stains, water stains, paint stains, pitch stains, mud stains, blood stains. Here is a stain upon the hat of a gentleman in company that I'll take clean out before he can order me a pint of ale." "Heh!" cried Sikes, starting up. "Give that back." "I'll take it clean out, sir," replied the man, winking to the company, "before you can come across the room to get it. Gentlemen all, observe the dark stain upon this gentleman's hat. No wider than a shilling, but thicker than a half-crown. Whether it is a wine stain, fruit stain, beer stain, water stain, paint stain, pitch stain, mud stain, or blood stain." The man got no farther, for Sikes, with a hideous imprecation, overthrew the table, and tearing the hat from him, burst out of the house. With the same perversity of feeling and irresolution that had fastened upon him, despite himself all day, the murderer, finding that he was not followed, and that they most probably considered him some drunken, sullen fellow, turned back up the town, and getting out of the glare of the lamps of a stage-coach that was standing in the street, was walking past when he recognized the mail from London and saw that it was standing at the little post office. He almost knew what was to come, but he crossed over and listened. The guard was standing at the door, waiting for the letter bag. A man dressed like a gamekeeper came up at the moment, and he handed him a basket which lay ready on the pavement. "That's for your people," said the guard. "Now, look alive in there, will you? Damn, that here bag, it weren't ready night before last. This won't do, you know." "Anything new up in town, Ben?" asked the gamekeeper, drawing back to the window shutters, the better to admire the horses. "No, nothing that I knows on," replied the man, pulling on his gloves. "Corn's up a little. I heard talk of a murder, too, down Spitalfields way. But I don't reckon much upon it." "Oh, that's quite true," said a gentleman inside, who was looking out of the window. "And a very dreadful murder as it was." "Was it, sir?" rejoined the guard, touching his hat. "Man or woman, pray, sir?" "A woman," replied the gentleman. "It is supposed—" "Now, Ben!" cried the coachman impatiently. "Damn that here bag," said the guard. "Are you going to sleep in there?" "Coming!" cried the office-keeper, running out. "Coming!" growled the guard. "Ah, and so's the young woman of property that's going to take a fancy to me, but I don't know when. Here, give hold. All right." The horn sounded a few cheerful notes, and the coach was gone. Sykes remained standing in the street, apparently unmoved by what he had just heard, and agitated by no stronger feeling than a doubt where to go. At length he went back again, and took the road which leads from Hatfield to St. Albans. He went on doggedly, but as he left the town behind him, and plunged further and further into the solitude and darkness of the road, he felt a dread and awe creeping upon him, which shook him to the core. Every object before him, substance or shadow, still or moving, took the semblance of some fearful thing, but these fears were nothing compared to the sense that haunted him of that morning's ghastly figure following up at his heels. He could trace its shadow in the gloom, supply the smallest item of the outline, and note how stiff and solemn it seemed to stalk along. He could hear its garments rustling in the leaves, and every breath of wind came laden with that last low cry. If he stopped, it did the same. If he ran, it followed. Not running, too, that would have been a relief, but like a corpse endowed with the mere machinery of life, and borne upon one slow, melancholy wind that never rose, that never fell. At times, he turned with desperate determination, resolved to beat this phantom off, though it should look him dead. But the hair rose from his head, and his blood stood still, for it had turned with him, and was behind him then. He had kept it before him that morning, but it was behind him now. Always. He leant his back against a bank, and felt that it stood above him, visibly out against the cold night sky. He threw himself upon the road, on his back, upon the road. At his head it stood, silent erect and still, a living gravestone, with its epitaph in blood. Let no man talk of murderers escaping justice, and hint that Providence must sleep. There were 20 score of violent deaths in one long minute of that agony of fear. There was a shed in a field he passed that offered shelter for the night. Before the door were 3 tall poplar trees, which made it very dark within, and the wind moaned through them with a dismal wail. He could not walk on till daylight came again, and here he stretched himself close to the wall, to undergo new torture. For now a vision came before him, as constant and more terrible than that form. From which he had escaped. Those widely staring eyes, so lustreless and so glassy, that he had better borne to see them than think upon them. That he had better borne to see than think upon, appeared in the midst of the darkness, light in themselves, but giving light to nothing. There were but 2, and they were everywhere. If he shut out the sight, there came the room with every well-known object, some indeed that he would have forgotten if he had gone over its contents from memory, each in its accustomed place. The body was in its place, and its eyes were as he saw them when he stole away. He got up and rushed into the field without. The figure was behind him. He re-entered the shed and shrunk down once more. The eyes were there before he had lain himself along, and here he remained in such terror as none but he can know, trembling in every limb, and the cold sweat starting from every pore, when suddenly there arose upon the night wind the noise of distant shouting, the roar of voices mingled in alarm and wonder. Any sound of men in that lonely place, even though it conveyed a real cause of alarm, was something to him. He regained his strength and energy at the prospect of personal danger, and springing to his feet, rushed into the open air. The broad sky seemed on fire, rising into the air with showers of sparks, and rolling one above the other were sheets of flame, lighting the atmosphere from miles round, and driving clouds of smoke in the direction where he stood. The shouts grew louder as new voices swelled the roar, and he could hear the cry of "Fire!" mingled with the ringing of an alarm bell, the fall of heavy bodies, and the crackling of flames as though they twined around some new obstacle and shot aloft as though refreshed by food. The noise increased as he looked. There were people there, men and women, light bustle. It was like new life to him. He darted onward, straight, headlong, dashing through briar and brake, and leaping gate and fence as madly as the dog who careered with loud and sounding bark before him. He came upon the spot. There were half-dressed figures tearing to and fro, some endeavoring to drag the frightened horses from the stables, others driving the cattle from the yard and outhouses, and others coming laden from the burning pile amidst a shower of falling sparks, and the tumbling down of red-hot beams. The apertures, where doors and windows stood an hour ago, disclosed a mass of raging fire, walls rocked and crumbling into the burning well. The molten lead and iron poured down white-hot upon the ground. Women and children shrieked, and men encouraged each other with noisy shouts and cheers. The clanking of the engine pumps and the spirting and hissing of water as it fell upon the blazing wood added to the tremendous roar. It shouted, too, till he was He shouted too, till he was hoarse, and flying from memory and himself, plunged into the thickest of the throng. Hither and thither he dived that night, now working at the pumps, and now hurrying through the smoke and flame, but never ceasing to engage himself wherever noise and men were thickest, up and down the ladders, upon the roofs of buildings, over floors that quaked and trembled with his weight, to under the lee of falling bricks and stones. In every part of that great fire was he, but he bore a charmed life, and had neither scratch, nor bruise, nor weariness, nor thought, till morning dawned again, and only smoke and blackened ruins remained. This mad excitement over, there returned with tenfold force the dreadful consciousness of his crime. He looked suspiciously about him, for the men were conversing in groups, and he feared to be the subject of their talk. The dog obeyed the significant beck of his finger, and they drew off stealthily together. He passed near an engine where some men were seated, and they called to him to share in their refreshment. He took some bread and meat, and as he drank a draught of beer, heard the firemen, who were from London, talking about the murder. "He has gone to Birmingham, they say," said one. "But they'll have him yet, for the scouts are out, and by tomorrow night there'll be a cry all through the country." He hurried off and walked till he almost dropped upon the ground, then lay down in a lane, and had a long but broken and uneasy sleep. He wandered on again, irresolute and undecided, and oppressed with the fear of another solitary night. Suddenly he took the desperate resolution of going back to London. "There's somebody to speak to there, at all events," he thought. "A good hiding place, too. They'll never expect to nab me, there, after this country scent. Thank you. Why can't I lay by for a week or so, and forcing Blunt from Fagin, get abroad to France? Damn me, I'll risk it." "Your manner, no less than your actions, assures me that you have never forgotten it, or ceased to think of it with bitterness," returned Mr. Brownlow. "I speak of 15 years ago, when you were not more than 11 years old, and your father but 31, for he was, I repeat, a boy, when his father ordered him to marry. Must I go back to events that cast a shade upon the memory of your parent, or will you spare it and disclose to me the truth?" The dog, though, if any descriptions of him were out, it would not be forgotten that the dog was missing, and had probably gone with him. This might lead to his apprehension as he passed along the streets. He resolved to drown him, and walking on looked about for a pond, picking up a heavy stone and tying it to his neckerchief as he went. The animal looked up into his master's face while those preparations were making, and whether his instinct apprehended something of their purpose, or the robber's sidelong look at him was sterner than ordinary, skulked a little further in the rear than usual, and cowered as he came more slowly along. When his master halted at the brink of a pool, and looked round to call him, he stopped outright. "Do you hear me call, 'Come here'?" cried Sikes, whistling. "My father," came up from the very force of habit. But as Sikes stooped to attach the handkerchief to his throat, he uttered a low growl, and started back. "Come back," said the robber, stamping on the ground. The dog wagged his tail, but moved not. Sikes made a running noose, and called him again. The dog advanced, retreated, paused an instant, turned and scoured away at his hardest speed, The man whistled again and again, and sat down and waited in the expectation that he would return. But no dog appeared, and he resumed his journey.